that I'm going to be sharing with you today focuses on anti-colonial Marxist thought in Portuguese and French India, based on archival and other primary sources from public and private archives in Asia and Africa. The sources I draw on in this essay were written in French, Portuguese, English, and Italian. So that gives you a little bit of a sense of the methods. So my motivation for this paper is what I'll start with today, and then provide some brief historical background on both the Portuguese and French empires in India, because I think even for South Asia specialists, these are sort of lesser known historical trajectories of South Asia. And then I'll also share some biographical information about the two theorists that I'm going to be discussing today, Subbiah first, and then Aquino de Bragança. I'll delve into their biographies and then their core theories and compare and contrast their theoretical perspectives before offering some conclusions. So when we think about the study of empire, this is a central object of analysis in many humanities and social science disciplines. And when it comes to the study of empire in the South Asian context, however, the examination of Dutch, Oldenburg, Portuguese, and French empires has been eclipsed by scholarship that almost exclusively focuses on the British Raj. But in our relative neglect of the trajectories of other European empires in South Asia, valuable insights into multiple colonial inheritances are left largely unacknowledged. So from a historical sociological perspective, the historical sociology of empire impresses us with the need to examine these multiple imperial trajectories, but with key exceptions. This scholarship tends to focus on the administration of political power from metropole to colony in order to better understand the nature of modernity. And this, of course, neglects how different imperial formations create variations in anti-colonial movements. Recent work by historians aims to recover the agency of the anti-imperialist left of British India, but the anti-imperialist left in other European empires in South Asia has been relatively neglected. So my task in this essay is to bring together and build on scholarship in the historical sociology of empire, along with recent scholarship by historians recovering the South Asian anti-imperialist left, to analyze how various imperial formations engendered different anti-colonial strategies, which then in turn led to different opportunities to decolonize. So to achieve this objective, I'm comparing the theories and praxis of the Goan Marxist Aquino de Bragança with Pondicherry Marxist Subbiah, both of whom were involved in movements for national independence. So when we think about the French Empire in the South Asian context, early 20th century Pondicherry in particular was a center of textile production within the French Empire. Most workers in the Pondicherry textile mills were Dalit, and Pondicherry workers were often brought in as strikebreakers in Madras Presidency, where labor was far more militant. So we see this cooperation among different European colonial empires. But after the Great Depression, Pondicherry workers began to form trade unions. And by the late 1930s, Pondicherry workers had won better protections compared to workers in British India. These protections included an 8-hour workday with overtime, pensions, paid medical treatment for accidents occurring on the job, 5 months of paid maternity leave, and guaranteed employment for the children of workers killed on the job. In June 1940, however, conditions across the French Empire changed dramatically with the Franco-German armistice, which created a collaborationist regime aligned with Nazi Germany. France's colonies supplied the Third Reich with essential commodities, while Vichy authorities established penal, labor, and internment camps for Jews and communists in French colonies. In French India, Vichy meant press censorship, the banning of public meetings and May Day celebrations in particular, the closure of public libraries, cultural centers, leftist newspaper offices and trade unions, and left and anti-colonial movement leaders were arrested and tortured. The French Indian military police recruited loyalist vigilantes to attack anti-colonial nationalists. The Communist Party of French India in this fraught situation was seen as the main instigator of the independence movement for French India, seeing increased urgency for this endeavor after the empire's fascist turn in 1940. So V. Subbiah was integral to this entire historical context, and Subbiah was born a Brahmin in Pondicherry City in 1911. His mother tongue was Telugu, and he was comfortable in French and had some proficiency in Tamil and English. As a university student in Madras, Subbiah became involved in the Gandhian movement, and upon his return to Pondicherry after university, became involved in nationalist organizations. Subbiah became a communist after meeting the Rawalpindi communist Dada Amir Haider Khan, who was underground in Pondicherry and Madras presidency after his conviction in the Meerut conspiracy case. After becoming a committed communist, Subbiah began to organize Dalit workers in Pondicherry textile mills as the secretary of the Pondicherry branch of the All India Harijan Seva Sangh. He then became secretary of the Communist Party of French India, and after the Vichy clampdown, began to rethink his commitments to the caste class struggle and instead see independence from Vichy France as the primary objective for the communist movement of French India. He, along with his wife, Saraswati Subbiah, led an anti-fascist movement enlisting support from anti-fascists in Algeria, and was greatly influenced by the writings of Ho Chi Minh on Vichy repression in Vietnam. So when we think about V. Subbiah's Marxist thought, I contend that we can characterize it as a Dalit anti-fascist, anti-colonial Marxism. Organizing Dalit workers was critically important for Subbiah's development as both a trade unionist and a theorist, and led him to rethink traditional Marxist class analysis, instead seeing the eradication of caste as his main objective and as the main objective for trade union efforts in the South Asian context and beyond. Subbiah believes that trade unions in India should, in addition to their traditional objectives, provide social services to Dalit neighborhoods, such as night schools, bathing facilities, and drainage of sewage and other liquid waste. One of Subbiah's most admirable strengths as a labor organizer was his ability to listen to the needs of others and adapt his thinking and strategies in order to better accommodate their needs. He not only listened to Dalit workers and modified his trade union strategy to center caste, but he also had exchanges with the Confédération Générale du Travail, through which he learned about anti-fascist strategies that would then become central to his political and theoretical work in the 1940s. With the rise of the Vichy state, Subbiah once again pivoted his political strategy, seeing independence as the central objective for communist movement and the communist movement in Pondicherry in particular. For Subbiah, it was impossible to disambiguate fascism in the metropole from colonialism in French India. Colonial officials were, in his view, an articulation of European fascism. And as such, Subbiah saw a victory against colonialism as a defeat for fascism. He looked with rapt attention to Ho Chi Minh's struggle in Vietnam, but also to independence movements in Algeria, Madagascar, and Senegal with hope, seeing not just a victory for one as a victory for all, but any blow to empire as a blow to the morale of colonial officials in French India. So in the historiography on comparative empires, the Portuguese Empire is largely seen as an outdated approach to colonizing by the 17th century, but it was strangely or puzzlingly, from the perspective of some historians, the most enduring modern European empire. Portuguese India was originally conquered by Vasco da Gama to connect Portugal's trade routes in the South China Sea with those through the Indian Ocean. And in 1932, Antonio de Oliveira Salazar established the Estado Novo, modern Europe's longest lasting dictatorship. The colonies were a cornerstone of the Estado Novo, as they were meant to fund the metropole through resource extraction and comparatively cheap labor. The concept of Lusotropicalism developed as the ideological foundation of empire under the Estado Novo, contended that the Portuguese Empire was a unified nation with a singular language, culture, and religion, buttressed by racial fluidity and multiracialism. Lusotropicalism was consistently evoked by Salazar to fend off Indian Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru's attempts to incorporate Goa into independent India in the 1940s and 50s. Aquino de Bragança was born in Bardez, Goa in 1924, and worked primarily in Portuguese and French, but also wrote in English and Italian. He completed his BA in philosophy from the University of Lisbon while living in the Casa dos Estudiantes do Imperio, a dormitory for students from the colonies that became an important incubator of Lusophone anti-colonial thought. Bragança did his PhD in Paris and obtained an assistant professorship in Morocco, and then after that, a tenured position in Algiers, where he founded Concept, an organization that trained guerrilla fighters from various Portuguese colonies. Through Concept, Bragança attempted to coordinate simultaneous armed uprisings across the Portuguese Empire. And then in 1974, he left academia to join Frelimo, Mozambique's independence movement. And after Mozambique won independence from Portugal in 1975, he stayed in Maputo to set up the research institute Centro de Estudos Africanos at the University Eduardo Mondlane. He remained a professor in Maputo until his assassination in 1986 by the apartheid South African government. One of the most important theoretical concepts Bragança developed is the concept of colonial fascism. Because the Portuguese Empire was administered by a fascist state, the conditions and possibilities for national liberation in the colonies were structured by the fascist nature of the metropole. This refashioning of the dynamic between metropole and colony in the Portuguese context also shaped his rethinking of class analysis in the colonial context, seeing Portuguese reliance on empire as part of their position barely in the core of the capitalist world system. As such, Bragança saw the global bourgeoisie in Portugal, in the colonies, but also elsewhere, as the main threat to colonial independence movements, and this geographic mismatch of the global class struggle. In other words, that capital is global, but workers and peasants, which he saw as this singular fluid category, necessarily launched movements against colonial rule in national containers rather than waging one unified empire-wide movement against empire. Systematic historical analysis and a deep understanding of regional context were central to Bragança's scholarship. Rigorous history, he believed, could transform social and economic relations through better understanding past missteps, current contradictions, and ultimately leading to better strategy. Bragança's attenuation to history, regional context, and theory helped him to overcome what Boaventura de Sousa Santos calls the scientific deficit of the colonizer. In other words, that colonial epistemes are unable to build knowledge about the colonial context for the purposes of liberation. Subbiah and Bragança have three main commonalities in their theoretical approach, in that they both rethink Marxism to better fit the global South context, and particularly their imperial context, whether it's the French or Portuguese. They both theorize the relationship between fascism and colonialism, which is also related to their thinking through these questions in the context of the Portuguese and/or French empires. And finally, intellectual and political connections to Algeria were critically important for their theoretical development and their political praxis. However, they also diverged in significant ways. So for Subbiah, caste was a central concern of his theorizing and his politics, while Bragança didn't take up the caste question. Bragança spends a great deal of his theoretical efforts on the transition to independence and the question of decolonization post-independence, while Subbiah remains focused on winning independence rather than theorizing what comes next. And finally, we see Bragança take this macro-historical view of capitalism rooted in his commitments to Marxism-Leninism and also world systems analysis, while Subbiah, in contrast, centers his theoretical efforts on how the transition to Vichy rule adversely affects opportunities for class caste liberation in Pondicherry very specifically. So through this comparison of Aquino de Bragança and Subbiah's theories of colonial independence, it's evident that different imperial political formations and linkages engender different anti-colonial strategies to foment movements for national liberation, which then in turn structure the available opportunities to decolonize after independence. These implications have several consequences for a Marxist theory of anti-imperialism. So first of all, the reference category one takes matters. Both Subbiah and Bragança had to develop a modified Marxism to better fit their local context and their imperial acumen. They couldn't take orthodox Marxist categories as a given and reasonably apply them to Pondicherry or to Mozambique. In this move to fit Marxism to their local context, not only they each developed theories of this nexism of fascism and empire, along with new ways of doing class analysis in their respective local contexts, but in so doing, they also forged new global South epistems for social science history. Both Subbiah and Bragança posit new readings of Marxism as this way of remaking the post-colonial self. And in so doing, they not only positioned themselves as political subjects, but also became what they are. Through these theoretical innovations that remade the French Indian and Portuguese Indian South, a new politics emerged that led communists in both French and Portuguese empires to win independence from the metropole. So thank you for listening to me. And I'm really looking forward to any feedback or questions that you might offer. So thank you again for being here for this.